Hello. Hello, bonjour. My name is Megan Ho, and I'm the Exhibition and Interpretation Coordinator at the Ottawa Art Gallery. On behalf of the OAG, I would like to welcome and thank you for joining us for our panel program this afternoon. Before I go further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the Ottawa Art Gallery operates on the beautiful Anishinaabe Aki. The Anishinaabe have been on this territory, known today as the City of Ottawa, since the beginning of time. All sorts of art forms have been, continue, and will continue to be part of the vibrant Anishinaabe culture. In this afternoon's program, co-curators of our current exhibition, Shapes in Between, Norman Takeuchi, a retrospective, and contributing authors of the forthcoming exhibition catalog, Catherine Sinclair, Sachiko Okuda, and Bryce Kanbara, join artist Norman Takeuchi for a discussion that explores the artistic practice, life story, and relationship to both Canadian and international art scenes. The first portion of the program will include a short presentation by each speaker, followed by questions within the panel and a moderated discussion with Norman. After this, we will open the floor to the audience for any Q&A. Please note that the presentation portion of the talk will be held in English, but please feel free to pose any questions in French and we can offer interpretation. The program will also be recorded where it will be kept for further access. I also want to take a moment to thank our core funders, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Ottawa for the support of programs like this. I am also pleased to introduce our panelists for today and share a bit of their bios with you before we begin. For their full profiles, please see the page for this panel at the events portion of our website. Norman Takeuchi is an artist who hardly needs an introduction here. Nevertheless, born in Vancouver, some of his earliest memories are of the interior of BC, where his parents were forced to relocate during World War II. Ultimately graduating from the Vancouver School of Art in 1961, Takeuchi went to London, England the following year to concentrate on painting, and again in 1967 with a Canada Council grant. In 1963, he moved to Ottawa to take a federal government design job that led to his joining the design team for the Canadian Pavilion at Expo 67 and then Expo 70 in Osaka, Japan. In 1970, he began his 26-year career as a graphic and exhibition designer for the National Museum of Natural Sciences, now the Canadian Museum of Nature. In 1996, he left the design profession to begin a new career as a full-time artist. Since then, he has participated in many solo and group exhibitions locally and nationally. His work is represented in permanent collections of the Royal Ontario Museum, the Canadian War Museum, the Ottawa Art Gallery, the Canada Council Art Bank, City of Ottawa, Carleton University Art Gallery, and in private collections in Canada and abroad. Exhibition co-curator and contributing author, Catherine Sinclair, is Deputy Director, Chief Curator at the Ottawa Art Gallery. At the OAG since 2006, she has curated work by artists from the Ottawa-Gatineau region, Canada, and beyond. She's an alum of the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program and has presented at the University Art Association Conference and the Canadian Women Artists History Initiative Conference, and has published in the Journal of Curatorial Studies and Essay, Arts and Opinion. Exhibition co-curator and contributing author, Sachiko Okuda, is a third-generation Japanese-Canadian whose parents were interred during World War II. A lifelong volunteer in the Japanese-Canadian community and with newcomers to Canada, she was president of the Ottawa Japanese Community Association in the years following the 1988 Japanese-Canadian Redress Agreement, and again from 2014 to 2018. She's an alum of the Japan Exchange and Teaching Program, and for more than 15 years, she was co-producer and co-host of the community program Contact Japan. She has contributed to several Japanese-Canadian themed exhibitions across the country. Exhibition co-curator and contributing author, Bryce Kanbara, is a visual artist and curator-proprietor of You Me Gallery in Hamilton, Ontario. He was a founding member and first administrator of Hamilton Arts, Inc., and has held curatorial positions at Burlington Art Gallery of Hamilton, Glenhurst Art Gallery of Brant, and Art Gallery at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Centre in Toronto. He was executive director of the Toronto chapter of the National Association of Japanese Canadians, and in 2021, Bryce received the Outstanding Contribution Award, Governor General's Awards in Visual and Media Arts. Thank you again, and thank you all for joining us today. And without further ado, I am now pleased to hand the mic over to Catherine Sinclair to begin the conversation with our panelists.
Thanks, Megan. It's give Megan a round of applause. She's so good. She's so good at her job. And thank you all for coming, and thank you to my fellow panelists. And yeah, we've been a really amazing team for the last year plus working on this exhibition. So I will not delay. I'm actually going to turn it over fairly quickly right now to the man of the hour, Norman Takeuchi, and let him start us off.
Thank you, Catherine. Is my mic working? Yes. So, putting together this exhibition was really quite an experience for me. It was, well, when Catherine first asked me to see my work, this was during one of her many studio visits, she said she wanted to see everything. So I started pulling work out. But I didn't realize that what she really meant was everything. and I got a lot of work sitting in a studio. So this was quite a long process, I would say. Yeah. But she also was digging quite deeply into my past and asked me all kinds of questions, which a lot of things that I could not remember. So I kept saying, well, I don't remember. But in the end, what she pulled together was a pretty good story of my life and the art that I produced. It turned out to be a pretty comprehensive show, and 60 years of work, and you managed to get it all in one room. Pretty good. And it just turned out to look fantastic. I just cannot be more pleased with the way the show looks. The work looks so much better in this gallery than in my studio. So thank you. And thank you to the Ottawa Art Gallery. What I want to say too is that this retrospective is not just about me and my work. It goes beyond. It goes beyond the theme that I've been working on for the past while, and that is about being Japanese Canadian. And this is where Bryce and Sachiko come in. Bryce, with his very broad knowledge of art in Canada and of the contributions that the Japanese Canadian artists have made in Canada. And Sachiko, with her vast knowledge of the Japanese Canadian community, together they really added so much to the show, so much substance and depth, and just raised the exhibition to another level. And for that, I really appreciate it. And the other thing that occurred to me was that there are so many people involved in setting up this exhibition, all the people in the gallery and people sitting here, that I now see this as a group show, not a solo exhibition. And it's just been a fantastic experience. Now, when I looked at this exhibition, it was the first time that I got a chance to see all my work together. 60 years of work. You made a good selection so that it gives a broad view of all the different stages that I went through. And the impression that I got looking at the work is that it shows how over the years, in all these various phases, that I was searching for some sort of identity about myself. And I think that it shows up in the work that I've produced. It's pretty complicated, But I think I can boil it down to two key points in my life, and that is that the searching for identity, and making good life decisions. So the first decision that I made was perhaps the most important decision of all, and that was that I would go to art school instead of university to study architecture. And I made this decision after I happened to go to the Vancouver School of Art for a night course in graphic design. And I was walking down the hallway and I looked into one of the rooms. It was a studio. It was full of canvases and easels and paint on the floor. And I thought, this is where I belong, not at the university. And so I signed up at the Vancouver School of Art. I was there for 4 years, and it completely changed my life. Up until then, I was leading a pretty conventional Canadian life, and as I said, I was going to go to university. But the decision that I made was, I know now, the right one. I've never had any regrets. It's been a great life. That was, I would say, a life-changing decision, and everything flowed from that decision. Let's see. Oh, yeah. I wanted to say that at the art school, I was suddenly in an environment that I had never experienced before. I had no idea that these kinds of people existed. And I just, I think I had some difficulty fitting at first, but then I got the hang of it. And I became an art student with paint on my pants and all the other stuff. And I've made some very good friends while I was there, and we're still friends. The second decision that I made, which is really important, was that I moved to Ottawa after spending a year in London painting. And it's important because that's where I met Marion. And together, then I found that I didn't have to make any decisions by myself anymore. There were the two of us. And I think my career in art really picked up steam after that. Earlier I said there were 2 points. The second point about searching for identity is something that I struggled with for many years, and it was a struggle that went well into my adulthood, and a lot had to do with the way the Japanese Canadians were treated during Second World War. It was a traumatic time for the Japanese community. They were the Canadian government when Canada joined the war against Japan in 1942, the Canadian government looked at the Japanese community as a threat, a security threat. They invoked the War Measures Act, and which gave them they were able then to strip the Japanese Canadians of their property, their citizenship. They were labeled enemy aliens and sent off to internment camps. Now this was a really humiliating experience, and I think I, along with a lot of the people in the community, carried these feelings of shame and humiliation for a long time, and I know that I did. It was something that I had a lot of difficulty getting over. I remember being, as a teenager, I wanted to be anything other than Japanese. And in fact, I wanted to be James Dean. I even tried to comb my hair like he did, but it didn't work. I didn't have the right hair. But because these feelings were so deep and so long-lasting, it affected the way I did my art. In that, my early art, I wanted to be recognized as a Canadian artist. And there was absolutely no indication in my work of my Japanese heritage. I avoided that deliberately. But there reached a point in my life when I thought, I'm just carrying too much baggage. It's affecting, there's too much negative feelings within me, and I've got to do something about that. And the only way that I could think of doing that, of getting over it, is through my art. And so my artwork made a shift. I made a shift in my art, and I started incorporating Japanese images into my work. And I wanted to say, this is who I am. And that really made a big difference in how I looked at myself. And also I discovered that I'm now producing art that is mine, that these are honest statements. And it gave me a lot of confidence in what I was doing. And up to that point, I was influenced by people, the American and British artists like de Kooning and Rauschenberg and Francis Bacon, Kittai. All these people were my idols, and a lot of my paintings were, you could see that I was influenced by them. But luckily, I was able to get past that and concentrate on my Japanese theme. And I spent about 20 years on that theme. So I think in the show you'll see that a good part of the exhibition is from that period. But I think I'm finally able to put aside my all the negative feelings that I've had, accept who I am, and my work now is sort of drifting towards abstraction, something that I started out with after art school, and something that I'm now going back to. So I think I can stop talking right there.
Thank you, Norman.
Sure.
It's really valuable to hear directly from you. And the way that we've decided to structure our conversation today is we do want it to be a conversation. So we're each going to present a short portion and then bring it back to Norman each time and ask him a question. And then once we've all kind of moved through our material, we will look to you for some questions later. So thank you, Norman, for getting us started. I'm going to go next. So for my portion of the presentation, I would like to speak to a few things that stood out to me throughout the last couple years. It's been at least 2 years that I've been working on this exhibition now. I often hear the question, how does a retrospective like this come together? In this case, Marian and Norman and I began the work literally wading through hundreds of artworks in our initial studio visits. And retrospective planning is a bit like this. You literally start with everything, as you said, and you work your way back to some kind of coherent storyline. And instinct, I find over the years I've learned to rely on instinct. What stands out? Something always stands out. Something pops and gives you that anchor as to how you're going to carry the story forward. So just change the slide. So I've known Norman's work for a long time, starting with this work that's on the screen now from the Ottawa Art Gallery's collection. This work in particular had always intrigued me with its dreamlike quality. It looks like a still from some kind of glamorous film noir. But what I didn't quite realize was that this kind of composition is emblematic of your wider practice, Norman. It combines seemingly disparate features right through from your earliest to your most recent works. This technique of creating conceptual collages, essentially, through painting and drawing is ubiquitous and consistent through your practice. It's stretched through works such as this one from 1965, street scene, up into the 1970s in your graphic art practice, and the amazing pop art inspired works like this one, Osaka 70s Superbus. I literally was like, where has this been all my life? When I found this. This is just amazing. Thank you for sharing this. It continued into works in the 70s, like this one from 1972, Pax Summer, as well as works like this. This was one of my favorites as well from the show, Mona Rosa from 73. So building the retrospective helped me to contextualize this technique in your more recent works and well-known works, such as works like this one, View of Mount Fuji from Lemon Creek. Here in this particular composition, which you finished in 2018, you tower the famed Japanese volcano depicted so iconically by printmaker Katsushika Hokusai in the 19th century over an archival image of wartime internment camp in Canada. Include kids finding joy in playing baseball and overlay and intertwine, or perhaps even obstruct, depending on how you look at it, the whole image with your own abstract forms. So it's through the combination of these elements that we are offered a window into their relationship within your mind as the artist. It was a work like this one that inspired the question in one studio visit, and I think it was you, Bryce, who asked this. You said, you asked Norman, where do you find yourself in an artwork like this, but with all these elements? And then I think you replied, Norman, something to the effect of, in the shapes in between, which ended up leading to the title of our exhibition. And you've described that you find yourself drawn to abstraction, particularly, because it feels like it's the most pure way that you as an artist can create something entirely new. Bringing it into the collage, like compositions like this, therefore you're bringing in a piece of yourself. But compositions like this might be telling us that you've found, that are you to be found in the composite of all these images, in between it all. So you, like us, we all find ourselves between, within, and built from a mixture of experiences, relationships, joys, and in some cases, traumas. So I want to talk about collage for a moment, because collage was something that just kept coming back to me, and it just wouldn't leave me alone as I was thinking through your work and all the threads that tie the 6 decades together. Collage is a widely recognizable concept, the idea of bringing together clippings from various sources to create something new. So it's interesting to just digress for a moment into a few parallels in art history. So, first coined as a term in the Western art world in 1912 by Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque. We have a very famous work here by Picasso, which was in the Western art world dubbed the first collage. It was part of a movement called synthetic cubism. The idea of cutting and gluing real-world materials onto a surface was yet another way that the cubists back then disrupted the straightforward image. Following World War I, this concept was picked up with vigor by the Dadaist movement. This nihilistic, multidisciplinary arts movement emerged in centers such as New York, Zurich, and Berlin in response to what one author called the insane spectacle of collective homicide that was World War I and its massacre of millions. Arguing that reason and logic had been responsible for the Great War, Dadaists felt that the absurd, irrational, and intuitive were the only routes forward, including artistic techniques such as collage for its use of chance pairings between elements. The Berlin Dadaists in particular, and this work is by the famous Hannah Höch, and they took this idea forward, creating the genre of photomontage to make politically activist images that juxtapose elements to comment on things like the shifting place in society for women. So back to your work here. We have Hastings Park. Unlike the deliberately anti-logic of some of these Dadaists, you, Norman, leave nothing to chance, but rather more like the social conscientious Berlin Dadaists, your compositions are carefully built, I think, combining elements that bring viewers a little closer to empathizing with the social justice causes that you address with keen awareness. So in the 1960s and 70s, some of your works included reflections on the universality of violence involved in things like the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War, for example. And then by 2006, you were ready to address the forced dispersal of Japanese Canadians, an injustice that directly affected you, as you said, your family and your community. As seen here in this work, Hastings Park, from the series A Measured Act in 2006, you literally collaged in items referencing this for the first time. And if you haven't been into the exhibition yet, we have a series of 5, and they're all on view, and they're owned by the Canadian War Museum. Just as collage developed as a part of synthetic cubism to offer new two-dimensional perspectives on objects on a picture plane, I think that you have used the medium to reveal a new perspective on your subjects. Through a juxtaposition of a variety of artistic styles in your compositions, for example, graphic or abstract, more subtle elements converse with others that spring forward with confidence, demanding attention. So from the nonsensical combinations created by the Dadaists in post-World War I to your response to the aftermath of traumas linked to World War II, such as the forced dispersal, the use of collage itself is closely tied to the advent of war and its ensuing confusion and chaos. In the chaos, we will not find order, but we will find an empathy into another's attempt to sort through the psychological impact. So I definitely have a new appreciation for this piece that I had admired for so long, as long with all the rest of your work. So I'm going to end my portion by turning to you, Norman, and asking you a question. So I do remember you describing to me at one point, maybe even years ago, that you weren't so sure about your earlier works, that perhaps you were trying so hard to fit in with what was being done, abstraction being very de rigueur at the time, that you weren't confident in what was actually authentically you. So seeing all of the work together in a retrospective like this, have you changed your mind at all? And do you have a new perspective on perhaps what you were trying to do back in the earlier decades? And do you see a relationship to what you're producing now?
Yes, I have changed my mind. Seeing all the work in this exhibition has really made me feel more confident about what I've been doing. Artists are always asking whether the work that they're doing is of any use. Is it worth it? Is it any good? And I always do that as well. I go through periods where I feel very unsure about what I'm doing. And seeing my work in this incredible gallery, suddenly my confidence level went way up. I feel as if I can, with this, with more confidence, take more chances and take more risks in what I'm doing, and continue to search for new ways of saying what I want to say. So, yes, I have changed my mind. I think the main problem with trying to figure out whether your work is any good or not is the fact that a measuring stick doesn't come with the business of making art. And so there's no way of measuring what it is that you're doing. So you just have to trust in your instincts, have faith in what you're doing, and just keep going. And so that's what I intend to do, but with more confidence. There was another part to this question.
No, it was just sort of like thinking about it, the works from the 60s and feeling like it was done maybe in a vacuum or with the influences that you were talking about before, de Kooning and Francis Bacon and others. You were looking to what others were doing. But when we looked at everything across everything, there's so many through lines for me between that early work. And so the subject matter was different. but there was recurring themes, there was recurring imagery, there was recurring use of medium and styles. And so, like, you knew what you were doing back then. You did. To me.
It might look like that.
Yeah. Okay, well, yeah, no, I mean, I think that's it. Why don't we move on to Sachiko's presentation next? And then I think between us, we're all going to have a really different kind of angles at coming at all the different ways that you work.
Sure.
So I will pass you this.
So, as has been mentioned, Norman, for many decades, did not reference in his art practice his Japanese-Canadian heritage. And yet, if you look at his works from, say, the 2000s on, which is when I discovered Norman's work, you'd say, clearly, this is a Japanese-Canadian artist. So what happened? I'm going to take a bit of a deeper dive into the theme of the internment and shame and whatnot, and sketch out the path that Norman took. And the landmarks that I'm going to use along the way are 3 points of intersection between Norman and me. Number one, we're both Japanese-Canadian. Number two, in 1967, Canada's centennial year, we both lived in Verdun, Quebec. And in 1995, we and Norman's wife, Marion, were all dazzled by an exhibition of kimono over in Gatineau. First, about being Japanese-Canadian. In 1937, Norman was born to Japanese-Canadian parents in Vancouver, which means that in 1942, he was one of the approximately 22,000 Japanese Canadians who were labeled as enemies and subjected to what is commonly, though inaccurately, called the Japanese Canadian internment, which lasted until 1949. And in case you need reassurance about your math skills, Norman being interned at the age of 5 in 1942 means that he is 85 years old. I won't detail what happened during what my father stoically called the years of our hardship. But I do encourage you to check out the links on the OAG website, including the seminal work, The Politics of Racism, written by Ottawa-based historian Ann Sunahara. What I do want to take a moment to reflect upon is one of the pervasive impacts of the internment, and that is shame. We, the victims, felt shame. And I know that's perverse because we didn't do anything wrong except be Japanese Canadian. But I'm telling you, the shame of the victim is a real thing. And I know this to be true because I inherited it from my parents, like many Japanese Canadians of my generation. Which brings us to this second intersection between Norman and me. Verdun, Quebec, and 1967. Although World War II ended in 1945, Japanese Canadians were barred from returning to the West Coast until 1949. My parents gave up on returning home and instead moved halfway across the country to Verdun, where they were regarded very much as oddities. And what was the result of that? My parents insisted that my siblings and I do nothing to call attention upon ourselves. My mother said, when they call you ching chong, and by the way, adults as well as children, imagine, you say, I'm Canadian. Meanwhile, Norman's family finally made it back to Vancouver in 1952, where, as was mentioned, he went to art school, then spent a formative year in London, England, in the swinging 60s in London, to paint, followed by a move to Ottawa, where he met Marion. And in 1967, when I was doing my best to be a good Canadian and inaudible and invisible in Verdun, Norman and Marion had moved to Verdun for Norman's job at Expo 67, working on the Canadian Pavilion. What could be more Canadian than that? It's no wonder that Norman viewed himself as a Canadian artist. But for me, Expo 67 was a watershed moment because it was the first time in the public sphere that I felt pride and not shame about being Japanese Canadian. A small example, at the food concession, at the Japanese food concession at Expo, my sisters and I were whizzes at using chopsticks, okay? And I know that sounds totally frivolous, but it's not, because pride is fundamental to embracing your heritage. Norman's watershed moment didn't come until later, until 1995, when he and Marion took in the exhibit of achingly beautiful kimono at the Museum of Civilization over in Gatineau. By Japanese artist Ichiku Kubota, which this is the third and final intersection in this story. Okay. I saw the exhibition myself. In fact, I went 5 times. It was so beautiful. And here's a quote from Norman about the kimono by Ichiku Kubota. "It did make me think of who I am and my own ethnic background, and that there are Japanese like Ichiku Kubota who can do these beautiful things. It made me feel quite proud. It didn't affect my work right away, but it did sit at the back of my head for several years." And so the path was finally cleared for Norman to embrace his heritage and undertake meticulous research in order to incorporate Japanese cultural elements and Japanese Canadian historical and also personal references into the works that figure so prominently in Shapes in Between. And I'm out of time, but I'm going to squeeze in 2 final remarks. First, I'd like to make a shout out to the members of the local Japanese Canadian community who are here today. Some of you participated in consultations here at the gallery last fall that helped shape the exhibition, and some of you created the Japanese Canadian items or wrote the books that are for sale in the gallery shop. Kudos. And second, here's a piece of wisdom that is directed to you, the viewers of Norman's art. And I feel okay with calling it wisdom because it doesn't come from me, it comes from Bryce, okay? So initially I turned down Catherine's invitation to join the curatorial team because I felt inadequate. I don't know very much about art. But Bryce, you encouraged me to reconsider, and this is what you wrote. "If you are concerned about feeling out of your element, don't. All you need to do is to spend some time looking at Norman's work. There's the art object, the viewer, and the art experience, which opens like a connecting channel between the two. And the nature of that experience is personal and different and valid for each person. Allow yourself to enter that relationship." Yeah, you wrote that in an email. And that is my encouragement to all of us as we experience the shapes in between. Okay. And my question to Norman is not about being Japanese Canadian, because I know about that. It's about art, which I don't know so much about, particularly abstract art. So you identify primarily as an abstract artist, and yet there's a substantial number of works in the show that have representational figures, including pieces that have both abstract shapes and representational figures. So just tell us about that.
I'd love to draw from a very young age, so drawing is very important to me. And when I draw, it's always very representational. So I have strong roots in representational art. It was only when I started going to art school that I discovered there are other forms of art. It's possible to take something that you see in front of you, say a vase full of flowers on a table, and start to explore those shapes, make them to distort them, to change the colors, to move things around, and make something different, something new. And that really appealed to me. It was something that I found very challenging and quite exciting to do, and so I slowly started drifting in that direction. I never lost my love of drawing, and over the years, from time to time, I would go back to drawing, but always doing something representational. And usually there are people in these drawings. For some reason, when I paint, I feel much freer to experiment and to try different things, and usually it drifts into the area of abstraction. But in drawing, I have to do things that are recognizable. And I'm not too sure why that is, why I make that separation, but that's why in this exhibition you'll see examples of both, because both approaches to art are very important to me, and they go side by side. But even in my representational work, there's a basis, there's an abstract element to them. A lot of the compositions that I put together are based on abstraction. So abstraction is never really very far. Does that answer your question?
Thank you, Norman and Sachiko. That's great. I think we will now turn it over to Bryce, and I'll just
I'm a little concerned because Megan said that we had 5 minutes each, and so I must have about 11 seconds left. Is that okay? Okay. I believe my task today is to provide you with a sense of where Norman's work, and particularly the work that draws in Japanese and Japanese Canadian themes, how this work sits in the framework of what we might call Japanese Canadian art. Norman and Sachiko have covered this a lot, but as a result of the discrimination that Japanese Canadians suffered and endured during and after World War II, they generally immersed themselves in the project of assimilation afterwards. And some have even called it the project of disappearing, by subordinating their Japanese Canadian identities and striving to blend in and become good Canadian citizens. However, several Nisei second-generation visual artists achieved extraordinary levels of recognition as contributors to Canadian art history. And they set the bar really high for those of us who came afterwards. Norman was born about a decade after the three most illustrious Nisei artists. And they were Roy Kyoka, in my opinion anyway, Roy Kyoka, Kazuo Nakamura, and Takeo Tanabe. Norman is half Nisei and half Sansei. And as you've probably heard by now, he, as well as a lot of us Sansei, our third generation, were really late bloomers when it came to addressing our Japanese-Canadian heritage. And that's really not uncommon. Nisei and Sansei artists have arrived at this kind of epiphany of realizing their Japanese-Canadianness at various points in their lives and in their careers. Sometimes the exploration is slow to evolve. Sometimes it occurs suddenly. And sometimes it's sustained for years, and other times it's just short-lived. I kind of thought that it would be interesting to show you how some other artists have approached this rather ethnocentric theme in their work. Here's just a few examples of artists that I'm aware of, Japanese-Canadian artists, and I hope you'll find them kind of useful to provide some context. Oh, there's me. Okay, I was educated mostly in Western art, so most of my subject matter reflected that. And in 1972, these are all monoprints. They're all the same size, really. And monoprints, you start with a black inked surface, and you start wiping it away, right? So you're actually working with light. I suddenly started to make these images which were very Asian and I guess Japanesey. And people have said they're like self-portraits, really. And it was the first time I started to explore my Japanese-Canadian appearance, basically. I showed these to an old prof a couple of years afterwards, and he questioned why I was doing it, because I had no knowledge or experience of Japanese culture or traditions. And he was right, because I didn't know anything. But a few years later, I happened to meet a number of Japanese-Canadian artists, Sansei artists in Toronto, who were exploring the same thing, and gave me a lot of assurance. Next. This is Akira Yoshikawa, and he's one of the artists I met in Toronto. He was born in Japan, and he and his mother immigrated here when he was about 10 years old. But he's one of the very few, maybe the only Japanese-Canadian artist I know that's so completely influenced by Japanese aesthetics. And you can sense that in this work. This is a really early work from the 80s, where he's made a graphite rectangle and placed objects, including his plaster casts of his wife's hands in the top left there. And subsequently, he started to put the objects right on the floor, so he didn't have a platform at all. He went to Ontario College of Art. One of his instructors was Nobuo Kubota, and under whom he studied experimental sculpture, but he ended up doing this kind of work. Next. All right, this is a close-up of a work by Ken Fukushima, who's another sensei, and he's an architect in Toronto, and he makes these wonderful paintings. And it might be difficult to read at first, but it's rather, there's kind of broken designs, and he's very methodical in the way he works. But this is from his series called Tales of Genji. And you can see in the top left there the eyebrows of Lady Murakami. So he's kind of dissected her in this, but he's very influenced by Japanese imagery and literature. Next. This is Noboru Suwai, who was born in Japan but came to Canada and taught in Alberta, I think, at university. But he was a printmaker, and he used to do these deep, this is an etching. It's a very deep etching, and he used to include images of European furnitures in salon-type settings, over which he would print an actual woodcut, which is the center part. And it's, I don't know how closely you want to look at that, but it's also ukiyo-e, which Norman uses in his work, but this is shunga, so it's erotic art. And so that's how he kind of combined contemporary printmaking and traditional woodblock printing. Next. This is Lillian Michko Blakey, and she was very accomplished in mainstream artwork until about 2000 or so, when she had her epiphany and started to incorporate Japanese Canadian imagery into her work. So that's her mother on the left, and there's the barbed wire that symbolizes the internment, the identity card. And she's also included, Lillian's included her eyes at the top, sort of peering down. So that's how she addressed her Japanese Canadianness. And the next one is by her as well. Oh, there it is. And there's the iconic fishermen's boats corralled during the internment. And she's got a little story about her father had just repainted his boat, and they named it the Nancy, but they lost that. Next. This is Mia Turnbull, who's a Yonsei, so she's fourth generation. So she's half Japanese, and she makes masks out of her face and distorts them, and also uses Japanese characters, or no characters, and imposes those onto her own face. So they're about her self-appearance as well. Next. This is an exhibition that was at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in 2019, and it's Norman's work on the left and Mia's work on the right. And it was called Blended. But so some of those paintings of Norman's on the left will be very familiar to you. because they're in this show. Next. And that's it. So, yeah, Norman was part of this exhibition at the Royal Ontario Museum in 2019. And it included 8 Japanese-Canadian artists who had done works on the theme of the internment. And the works were actually distributed throughout the Sigmund Solomon Gallery at the ROM. So they were interspersed among furniture and artwork of Canadiana, including works like Benjamin West's Death of Wolfe, which everybody probably knows. So the point was that Japanese Canadians were dispersed across the country, just as these works were dispersed into the works of the Canadian collection. What else can I say? I think what's really significant about Norman's work, to me, is that, well, it's the way he's been really faithful to a really developed personal abstract sensibility. I mean, I really like abstract expressionism as well, and it's a difficult thing to be maintaining, and I really admire that you've done it all this time in your own way, and you're returning to it again. I think another thing is that there's just an undeniable beauty to Norman's work and a completeness to it. It's really solid. And a lot of that I think I attribute to his graphic design background. He just knows how to put things together and make it work. And also, I think for Japanese Canadian artists, the fact that he's incorporating Japanese, traditional Japanese and Japanese Canadian imagery and bringing them together and making us think about that. So it's making us think about the past, especially younger people like the Yonsei, making them think about the past and not only, I mean, it's easy to say it's pointing to the future, but I don't think we've done enough to think about Japan and our connections and our influences from Japan, because we cut it off with the internment. You want a question? My question was, and I think we've probably answered it, but and Norman has talked about it a lot, but I've asked it of Norman a couple of times now throughout the past few years. And I'll ask it again and see if it's changed. Should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, okay.
I know what's coming.
Yeah. What does Japanese Canadian mean to you? Being Japanese Canadian. What does being Japanese Canadian mean to you?
Yeah, you've asked me that question a couple of times, and I still can't remember what my answers were. Good. So I'll start from scratch. Being who I am I find very complicated. I know I'm Canadian, but quite often I find that I don't look like the people around me, and I must admit, after all these years, I'm still very conscious of looking different to people around me. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I always wonder when I'm out and maybe talking to people who don't know me, I'm wondering if they look at me and say and wonder, I wonder where he's from. And even recently, I was asked how long I've been here, which, And I understand questions like that because we're all interested, I think, in people who look different, and you wonder where they're from. And so it's not unusual, but it still irks that I'm asked that question. And I must say, though, that in terms of racism, I have not experienced that in a long, long time. And I feel very lucky that I live in a neighborhood where there are a lot of really decent, thoughtful, kind people who take me for who I am. And that gives me a lot of hope, because I know that there are other areas where it's not like that. So I'm thinking, even though there is a lot of, how do I put it? I'll just use the word racism, all across Canada in different areas. There are a lot of good, decent people that are open-minded and are accepting. And I know that because everyone that I know fits that description. So in the end, I think things are going to eventually work out. And that's how I feel about being who I am.
Thank you.
I'd just like to thank everybody who presented here today. I think we will, I have so many questions in my head, but honestly, I think we should turn to this audience because they have so many questions, I imagine, for us. And I just want to thank Bryce and Sachiko and Norman for the work that has brought us here today, for the work that you've all put into everything, your presentations. We also have an exhibition catalog coming out, and each of us has written something from the perspective that we've presented to you today, and that will be coming out July 27th, a month before the closing of the exhibition on August 27th. And you can sign up for a pre-order copy of that catalog in our shop or online, or just look out for it when it comes. So it's been an absolute pleasure working with you all. We dubbed ourselves Team Takeuchi. I just had to say it. It was just so fun. Team Takeuchi was awesome. And I've learned so much. And with that, let's just give them a round of applause. And now, if anybody does need to get up and stretch, feel free to do so. But we will move to our question period. And just so that you know, we are recording today. And if you have a question, please wait for the microphone. So we will have mics. Thank you. And just put your hand up for the microphone and just wait till it comes to you. So do we have any questions from the audience? And Megan and Jingen will do their best to get to you. Sure, yeah.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Dillon, and Norman, you mentioned several European artists that influenced you. Are there any Canadian artists that influenced you?
There's one in particular that influenced me, and that's Jack Shadbolt. He was teaching at the Vancouver School of Art, but the year when I got into fourth year, when he should have been teaching, he was on sabbatical, so I never got him as an instructor, which I always regretted. But yes, he was an influence. Another man is Gordon Smith, a true inspiration. He, when I happened to be in Vancouver when he was celebrating his 100th birthday, and he was having a solo exhibition of these enormous paintings that he had just finished, and I couldn't believe it. So he's another one.
Thank you, Laurie Peters. Catherine and Team Takeuchi, thank you so much for this important retrospective. Norman, I'm wondering if you would allow us to briefly board the psychedelic superbus, and if you could take us on a brief journey to Osaka 1970 World Expo.
I don't know whose idea that was, but it was a brilliant idea. And the concept was that we would decorate this school bus, and on top of it was a platform, a sort of a stage, on which a rock band called the Collectors would perform. And the bus was to go right across Canada from one end to the other, stopping at certain places and giving a concert. And inside the bus was a crew, a camera crew, and their job was to record the audience and their reaction, as well as to document the landscape as the bus went across Canada. And then at the other end, the bus was loaded onto a ship and transported to Japan, to Osaka, where it was incorporated into the pavilion. But during this time, they wanted the bus to travel through Japan and do the same thing. So we had to actually produce a second bus, a replica of the first. And that was pretty boring to do the same thing twice. But that got done, and that traveled around Japan. I don't know what happened to that one. And the other interesting thing was that because the bus was quite large for the pavilion, they actually had to, I think, install the bus early on and then build the pavilion around it. The pavilion, by the way, was designed by Arthur Erickson, and it was probably a hit in Japan at Expo, because it was so brilliant and beautiful.
And we should just add the point that it's the 50-year anniversary of Expo Osaka in 2025, and we will be again in 2020 in Osaka. And we're really excited about that serendipitous connection to this exhibition. Thanks, Laurie, for bringing that up. We have another? Okay. Yeah.
Norman, your work is amazing. It's here. Thank you. Yeah. After viewing your whole exhibition, I came to conclusion that you're a hardcore painter.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. If you could just speak up.
After viewing your whole exhibition, I realized that you're a hardcore painter, right?
Hardcore painter. Hardcore.
So the thing, actually, when I look back at the art history and practice, when you are practicing your work, 60s, 70s, 80s, I see that American art has been going through a lot, right? Artists such as Namjoon Paik and conceptualists, they all are working different ways, like new technologies came. So my question is, through your long career, so have you at any certain point thought of crossing your boundary and do work with technology or any other form of work? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I love being called hardcore. That's a first. No, I haven't. I'm not really drawn to technology, so I'm happiest with a brush and pencil and making marks on paper and canvas. So and at this.
There's other fans, apparently.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear all this clapping. And at this point anyway, I think even if I wanted to, I would probably find it just too difficult to deal with whatever it is that involves working with technology. I'm happy the way things are.
But I think you do like to give yourself challenges within what you do. So you, for example, said to me recently, "Well, I'm doing red and black right now." So you've limited yourself on purpose so that you can explore thoroughly one challenge, right?
That's right, yeah. I think artists dwell on, or they thrive on challenges. And I'm no different.
Good afternoon. I'm Nora Nishikawa from the Ottawa Japanese community. And before I ask my question, I just want to express a great deal of gratitude to Bryce and Norman. Because in the Japanese community of my generation, our parents and grandparents were pretty reticent about talking about their experiences and their heritage. On the other hand, in 1977, with the centennial of the first Japanese immigrant, both of you impacted me on opening my eyes, my ears, sometimes my mouth, and my brain to what is the possibility of understanding where I came from, where they came from, what happened to them, and what we can carve as our identity as Japanese Canadians today. So that is my moment to show my appreciation to you, and behind me stand voices of others. Because I said this to Bryce, and he was surprised that I was extremely grateful to what he contributed to the Japanese Canadian lane side. So I decided I would tell the rest of you, not just him. So thank you all. Norman, my question actually relates to your art for on the graphic side, because there are some classic images that Canadians or anyone can recognize of Japanese imagery. And for Japanese Canadian, those pictures are iconic of internment. But you crept into there some different graphic designs, which automatically, to me, since I work in paper crafts, washi, those graphic designs, those iconic symbols that are in some of your paintings, like the one there, right? Those little dots, the prints that come in washi paper. And I saw them, maybe because I like to look at those types of designs. But why did you decide to use certain ones of those graphic imagery? And what do you think it evokes in non-Japanese people to see it? Do they notice it? Or do they see Mount Fuji and the more abstract qualities of your work? So, long-winded questions, but.
Well, first of all, I don't really, when I do my work, I don't wonder what people are going to make of it. And the only important thing for me is whether I like it or not. And when I choose certain designs, it's mainly because at that particular moment, a particular design appeals to me. It has no real, most of the time anyway, they have no real significance other than the fact that I like them. And I might pick up a particular design because it works in with the rest of the composition. And a lot of the designs that I use are quite accurate reproductions of what I'm looking at in these reproductions of woodblock prints. So when I use images from the woodblock prints, I try to make them as accurate as possible.
And it's been a learning process for you. That's another thing you've mentioned. And we did include in the exhibition a display case with your books, some of your books. And Sachiko, you chose a page that showed two women from a woodblock print that is reflected in one of the paintings. So for you, it's been a learning process as well, would you say?
Oh yeah, very much, yeah. Even when I did the series, the Measured Act series, I didn't know enough about what had happened during the internment, so I had to learn. I had to read up on it. And the same with a lot of the other, for instance, my no theater masks. I was attracted to the masks, but knew very little about the theater, so I had to learn about that. So yes, it was very much a learning experience.
Are there any further questions? Oh, right in the right in the back and the front. Maybe we'll take one or two more questions.
Good afternoon, Aline Dimitri. I was invited here actually by Nora, and I discovered an artist that really touched me. So thank you very much. It's beautiful. The question I have, and I'm not sure if you started answering it, is around the color you use. So you have this very dark blue that you use very commonly. And I'm wondering, what kind of feeling does it give you? It has to communicate in some way, I believe, to you. And I'm wondering, what does it say to you? What does it mean to you, this color that is so prevalent in this abstract component of your art? Thanks.
It's funny you should ask that because I've been asked that a few times before. People have noticed that I use blue a lot. And I would love to say that it has some deep symbolic meaning, but in fact, I like blue. So that's why I use that color.
Sachiko wants to comment. Pass the mic.
Okay, so I was one of the people who asked that question of Norman. And because I don't come from an art background, I felt I had to, get the question right. So I'm thinking, ooh, Vermeer's blue, and then there's Japanese indigo, but wait, Hokusai, he used Prussian blue and whatnot, and it revolutionized printmaking. So then when I asked the question to Norman, tell us about the blue, he just said, oh, I just like that color. So there you go.
Hi, Melissa Kamibayashi from the Ottawa Japanese Community Association. I just want to thank Bryce, Sachiko, Catherine, and part of Team Takeuchi, Marion, as well as Norman for today and for all your deep thoughts on Norman's work and Japanese Canadian identity. I had an opportunity to speak to Norman, and talking about color, you were mentioning that what you're working on right now is the removal of color and to only focus on black. Can you talk about that? Thank you.
Well, for so many years, I spent working with color and exploring it. It was I found it that at first it was a challenge, and I enjoyed working with color. But over the years, I think I started to feel that it was, first of all, I started repeating myself with colors and color combinations, and I really don't like to repeat myself if I can help it. So I recently just stopped using color and decided that I would go completely in the opposite direction, reduce my palette to just two, that would be black and red. So these black and red pieces that I'm working on now is just a reaction to having spent many, many years working with color and getting a bit, I'm not too sure exactly what the right word is, but I just think, I feel as if I've had enough of that and I need a break. So the break for me is black and red.
That's it. Somebody said to you in one of our media interviews, what's next for you? And I was thinking, a nap, maybe? Like, seriously. And you were like, no, this series. Like, you just keep going. It's amazing. Anyway, we have one last question here, I think.
Looking at the Mount Fiji picture, I think I see an eagle's head and perhaps a whale or some finned creature in the dark bits. And also, what would be this? I'd like to ask what would be the significance of Lemon Creek? Does that represent interior BC and internment, maybe?
Yes, Lemon Creek was one of the internment camps.
Okay, I wouldn't have, I'm a war baby. I wasn't old enough to realize, and okay, I also visited and kept revisiting the Kimona exhibition at the then Museum of Civilization, I think it was called. And my last question, well, one comment and one question. I was quite surprised that every Japanese Canadian artist that we've seen, including yourself and Anne and Barry, have distinctly English or Canadian first names. Was that part of trying to blend in? Like, I can't imagine that you don't have a Japanese first name as well. Yes or no?
That's interesting. You'll have to ask my mother.
Okay.
I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I suspect it's because they wanted us to blend in with the rest of the community.
Well, that would have to be my guess.
And
My last question is, you've just juxtaposed a rose with pinking shears. And I relate to textile art, so I know it's pinking shears, which have, serrated edges. Is that because roses have thorns, or is there some other significance?
that painting actually is quite significant. It's not a very big one, but it represented the end of a whole series that I did using roses. And when I reached a point where I decided that I've had enough of roses, I painted that painting. And originally it was just a plain pair of scissors. But then I thought, well, I'll make it more interesting, and I made it pinking shears.
Well, ordinary scissors would have done the job.
But it's partly because my mother was a dressmaker, and I remember seeing shears like that.
Well, see, I own those as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. Thank you to our panelists and to the audience. Really great questions. And we invite you to come back many times. We're always free admission. Keep an eye on our website. Sign up for our e-newsletter. You'll find out about other talks happening and workshops for all ages and ways you can get involved. And the exhibition will be on until August 27th. And so please feel free to stick around and ask further questions, but thank you for coming today.